So let's discuss how the cardiovascular system responds to heat exposure. So before we go there, let's watch together a short video that explains a little bit some key terms about cardiovascular physiology and especially stroke volume and cardiac output. Just to remind you, stroke volume is the amount of blood that goes through the aorta and through the entire body after each heartbeat. So when the heart contracts, the amount of blood that goes to the body is called stroke volume. And cardiac output is the total amount of blood that goes through the heart per minute. So if we multiply the heartbeat, how quickly the heart pumps, with the volume, the stroke volume, how much blood goes with every pump, then we get for 1 minute, we get the total amount of blood that goes through the heart, and this is called cardiac output. So let's watch this video together.
Volume is directly correlated with cardiac output. The greater the stroke volume, the greater the cardiac output. Stroke volume represents the difference in the amount of blood between the volume in the ventricles at the end of diastole and the volume after systole. Three factors increase stroke volume: increased preload, increased contractility, and decreased afterload. Preload is the degree of stretch of cardiac muscle cells prior to contraction. The amount of stretch is related to the end diastolic volume. Increased return blood flow from the veins increases end diastolic volume. Cardiac muscle sarcomeres stretch and lengthen. Contraction of the cardiac muscle sarcomeres during ventricular systole provides the force to eject blood from the heart.
All right. Hopefully it didn't confuse you that much. So
volume is directly correlated with cardiac.
So a couple things you have to remember. So looking at the heart, of course, this is the left part of the heart. This is the right part of the heart. The left part of the heart, the atrial and ventricle, the ventricle is where all the blood goes from here. It goes through the aorta and it goes pretty much in the entire body. So part of it goes to the upper body through these arteries, and part of it goes to the arms and the lower body. The other part is the right part of the heart, which it's the blood that returns after the circulation, and it returns through the vena cava, the anterior and inferior vena cava. So those big veins that bring back to the heart the venous blood, which is high in CO2 and low in oxygen. So every time that the heart contracts, it brings blood back on the right-hand side. From here goes through the pulmonary artery. The venous blood makes it to the lungs, so it gets in the lungs, it releases CO2 and picks up fresh oxygen, and then it returns back to the heart here, and it goes through the atrium and ventricle, and from the ventricle goes back to the aorta and everywhere to the body. So one of the important things that I'm trying to explain, and hopefully that video gave a little bit of that inside, is that the amount of blood returning to the heart, so the amount of blood that returns through the anterior and inferior vena cava on the right-hand side, is related to the amount of blood that can be pushed out of the heart. So the more blood that returns here, the more blood can be pushed out. So keep that in mind. So we'll explain you in a little bit what happens in some situations. So let's start about a concept which is called orthostatic intolerance. I know one of the students mentioned that that C often has issue with orthostatic intolerance, and this is a very simple explanation of what happens. So when we stunned, for example, a small amount of blood, it gets distributed in the lower part of our body. So blood goes down to the legs and everywhere, right? So in a very, very simplified manner, it shows that the arterial blood goes through this line. Let me use my laser pointer. So the arterial blood goes down here, gets filtered, and then it returns through the veins, and it makes it back on the right-hand side of the heart. So through in that case, inferior vena cava. So from the vena cava makes it back to the heart. So if we keep standing for a long time and where your legs are quite relaxed, the amount of blood that stays in the lower part of the body, in the lower legs, increases and increases more over time. And you can see here some rough estimations from 100 ml of blood to 300 to 600. So why this thing happens? So as the blood returns here and the hydrostatic pressure due to the posture, because our heart is up here, the veins down in our legs are down here. So due to gravity, blood accumulates. And even though we have this system that you can fairly see it here with those narrower and wider parts, which is called the valves in the veins. So those valves, they situate like this, so they prevent backflow of blood going back to the arterial side. So what happens over time, as blood accumulates, those relax and they open. And as they open and they cannot close properly, more blood gets released, more blood actually stays down here. And the term that we use for that condition, we call it blood pooling. So blood pools in the lower part of our body. So what's the problem with blood pooling in the lower part? If it pulls down here, less blood will return on the heart, and then less blood will go on the left side of the heart, so less blood will go in the brain and less blood will go everywhere else. So we will have a significant amount of blood sitting around in vasculature around the body that does not return to the heart, and as a response, stroke volume decreases. So this is something that happens if we stand for a long time, all right? And if this thing is extreme and for a prolonged period of time, there is a risk of fainting because not enough blood returns to the heart and not enough blood makes it to the brain that constantly needs oxygen. If you faint, assuming that you won't get severely injured and you fell down, then by gravity, the blood will go back to the heart and everything will be resolved on its own without really having to do much. Sometimes you might be familiar that people, one of the first aid they do, they lift the legs. And when you lift your legs higher, it helps again by gravity to push the blood back to the heart and then from the heart to the brain. And then people get back and they feel better. So on the same topic, we have the opposite example where instead of having the orthostatic intolerance and blood pooling in the lower extremities, here we have hydrostatic pressure that pushes the blood back to the heart. So here we have water that goes all the way to the chest or water all the way to the neck. And here is a situation where we have just normal, somebody just standing. So visually you can see that the amount of blood that is around what we call the center of the body, or what we call central blood volume, the central blood volume expands. So we have more blood being around the heart versus amount of blood which is down in the extremities. So that is very helpful to have better venous return, and as a response you have higher stroke volume and higher cardiac output. So keep that in mind for a second, and we're going to now switch and see what heat does. So as we mentioned earlier, what heat does, heat exposure, redistributes the blood. So pay attention to the word. So obviously we're not bleeding out, we don't lose blood, what happens with the heat, we redistribute the central blood volume to the extremities. So here, by looking at the red color, you see you have much more blood in the heart, lung, and in the splanchnic area Versus in this example, when you have heat exposure, you have a lot of blood being in the extremities, so both in the legs and in the arms, just because the peripheral vasodilation sends blood to the skin, and that facilitates the heat dissipation to the environment. So we want to move the heat from the core, where, especially during exercise, where the muscles produce the heat, to the skin, and from the skin to the environment, so we can dissipate heat. So VO2, which is the amount of oxygen that we use, is the product of stroke volume times heart rate. So these two products is the cardiac output times the arterial venous oxygen difference, or AVO2 differences. So all that gives us an idea of how much blood is circulated and how much oxygen is subtracted from the tissues during circulation. So if we concentrate in this component, which is cardiac output, and we have stroke volume and heart rate, if less blood returns to the heart, what's going to happen, you think, to the stroke volume? So let me give you the answer. Stroke volume is going to go down. So as a response to the decline in stroke volume, what your body is going to do in the heart rate in order to maintain the same cardiac output, because your body still needs oxygen, whether it's hot or not. Your body still needs oxygen. Your brain needs oxygen. All the organs need oxygen. So what your body will do will increase heart rate. So one of the issues with the heat is that we have decrease in stroke volume and increase in heart rate. So just exposure to heat creates this distribution of blood, and as a response we have an increase in heart rate and decrease in stroke volume in order to maintain cardiac output. So let's combine now the example of standing for a prolonged period of time with the example of heat. So standing in the heat seems to be the most powerful signal for somebody to potentially faint. So people usually faint, people that they suffer from orthostatic intolerance, they rarely have problems in the winter. They mostly have problems in the heat. Because that combination of standing, the theory, the mechanism that I explained earlier with blood pooling, in combination with blood redistribution just because of heat exposure, then it creates a much greater stressor to the cardiovascular system. Are you with me? I hope so. So let me make the things a little bit more complicated. So imagine what happened when, other than the issue of redistribution, so we have more blood to the skin, we're standing for a long time, and we have more blood in our legs, so we have blood pooling. Imagine if you put in that recipe also a little bit of dehydration, where dehydration leads in shrinkage or decrease in plasma volume. So now not only you have less blood coming to the heart, you have overall your blood volume is smaller. So this is one of the most challenging situations for the cardiovascular system. Orthostatic, heat exposure, and dehydration together, it creates one of the most challenging environment for your cardiovascular system. One thing that is, of course, more problematic for humans compared to other people is it's that our heart is situated much higher than any other mammals. So our heart is approximately above 80% of blood volume versus, let's take the example of a dog, for example. Most of the blood is around the heart level. So in humans, most of the blood is below the heart level. So we have to take the blood that goes everywhere in the body and we have to return it to the heart, and from the heart it has to go all the way to the brain. So just by the upright posture, we put our system in a very challenging situation just because we're standing. Can you think of an example from another animal other than humans or dogs that could be in a worse situation than humans? Maybe an animal that their head is much higher than their heart. Correctly, it's the giraffe, of course. The giraffe has the head like if you many feet above the heart. So imagine how much more complicated it would be having to push the blood all the way to their head, right? So have you seen any giraffe fainting or having orthostatic intolerance? I don't think so. And this is because the giraffe actually have a very smart system in their legs, that the way it works like very similar to what the fighting pilots use, which is called the G suit. So they have a system in their legs and around the musculature that it is like a very tight layer of collagen that compresses the muscles. And by that compression, it's much easier for the fluid to be pushed back from the legs to the heart and go up in the brain. So because of that unique structure, because of that unique system, the giraffes are capable to lean their head all the way down to the floor, drink water, and bring their head back all the way up several feet above the ground and several feet above their heart, and without really having any issues of fainting. So just to help you understand the concept of blood pooling, I have this diagram, which is I found in a textbook from Larry Rowell, where he explains exactly what is the blood pooling, what it happens. And it's quite similar, both in orthostatic situations, somebody that stands for a long time, as well as the heat exposure. So imagine that part of the blood volume remains in the venous system. So imagine blood pooling in the skin because of heat exposure or by standing for a long time. So as a response, less blood returns to the right part of the heart, the right ventricle, that is going to go through the pulmonary blood flow, and then we will end up in the left ventricle to go to the heart. So if part of the volume gets redistributed here, then less blood will return to the right part of the heart, less blood will go in the left side of the heart, so less blood overall will be circulating, and that could be an issue. And your body is trying on its own to figure out what to do and what to sacrifice in order to perform better and perform substantially well. And it works very well most of the time, because most people don't faint all the time when we get either heat exposure or when we get standing for some time. This is a diagram that explains the difference in cardiac output and how blood cardiac output is distributed in a cool environment and in a hot environment. And you see a large percent of the cardiac output is dedicated to the skin blood flow to be able to dissipate heat. So let me share with you some data about what happens during exercise when you exercise in different environmental conditions. This is a very interesting study that was published a few years ago by Jose Gonzalez Alonso, who is a professor actually in Brunel University in London, but back in the time he was working in Copenhagen with Bodil Nielsen that we saw earlier today from the 1938 study. So this is what they did. This is a very clever experiment. They took people, the same people, and they tested them 3 different times. And they changed the initial body temperature before they start exercising in the heat. So they did either what is called pre-cooling, so they dropped their body temperature before the beginning of exercise. That was the control, the circles, and the square, the dark squares, represent the preheating. The pre-cooling and the preheating, they did it with hot or cold water immersion. So they either dropped their body temperature before they started, or they increased their body temperature before they started. So they started exercising, and they found 2 things. Number one, when the subjects were preheated, they end up lasting shorter period of time. So they end up quitting earlier because they got too hot and they felt uncomfortable. When the subjects were pre-cooled, they end up cycling for a longer period of time. So obviously what is interesting, you see that all three experiments, the subjects end up stopping right around of internal body temperature, esophageal in this case, of around 40 degrees Celsius. So what it seems with this data is that our body has some sort of sensor that senses the maximal esophageal temperature or the maximal internal temperature, and when we reach that high level, then our ability to maintain exercise is diminished. But take a little bit a look at this data that also represents the heart rate. You can see heart rate increases. When you start hot, your heart rate is higher. When you start pre-cooled, your heart rate is lower. It takes much longer to reach maximum heart rate of around 200 beats. And again, you see that the heart rate reaches about 200 beats per minute approximately in all three experiments, just in different durations. So much faster when you start with higher body temperature, a little bit later when you start with lower body temperature. The interesting data, I think, appear here in this slide, where you see at the end of exercise, the people end up quitting where their cardiac output start decreasing significantly. So you see heart rate goes up in a linear function, but cardiac output declines. And when the cardiac output declines, then the subjects cannot maintain exercise intensity, and they end up stopping their exercise performance test that they were doing. So the cardiovascular system seems to be more stressed in a hotter situation when you start with higher body temperature, and that seems to be one of the limiting factors. By the way, if you're thinking of elite performance and exercise performance, the technique of pre-cooling, it's something that some athletes are using before high-intensity exercise, especially in the heat, to potentially increase their capacity to exercise at very high intensity. And they do that before races by wearing ice vests or ice jackets in order to drop their body temperature a little bit and give them that small benefit. So out of the same study, they did another set of experiments, but now instead of changing their pre-exercise body temperature, instead of doing pre-cooling or preheating, what they changed was the rate by which they dissipate their own heat. So they use this fancy-looking suit. It looks like an exercise, like a sweats kind of suit, that inside it has tons of tiny little tubes. Those tubes are connected with a bigger tube, and there is a pump here that connects through that suit, and you can push either hot or cold water through the system. So they did the experiment on two different occasions. Both of the times they start at normal body temperature, which is 37 degrees, roughly around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And in one case, they had what they call high rate of heat storage. The black data were warm water was running through that suit, so they felt much warmer and they were storing heat much faster, versus cooler water was running through the tubes, and that time their body was able to dissipate heat much faster. You can see the differences in temperature, skin temperature, significantly lower in this case, significantly higher in the hot water experiment. You can see also here the heart rate results. You can see heart rate reached in both experiments, again, approximately the same level. But during the experiment with the warm water infusion through the suit, their heart rate reached maximum value much faster, and the subjects were not able to exercise for as long. So in closing, remember that heat exposure, by redistributing blood from the core to the skin, decreases venous return and decreases stroke volume, and as a response, our exercise capacity and everything declines. And we see it in two aspects. At rest, we see less ability to regulate blood pressure effectively, and people can faint easier. And during exercise, we see that people get Whenever they get hotter, their stroke volume decreases, their cardiac output decreases, and their ability to exercise in the heat also declines. A little bit later on, we will discuss how the combination of dehydration with high body temperature can have even greater effect on cardiovascular stability and overall performance. Let me know if you have any questions.